I think one of my favorite parts is the ending that I got, where there is this overall message of hope, though.
This game has serious content warnings.
Welcome back. I want to talk about Omori. Think of this as a content warning before we dive into things. This video is going to be talking about a lot of mental health stuff. We're going to be talking about trauma. We're going to be talking about anxiety. It's a lot that we may be talking about. So I wanted to put that out there. I also want to put out there that we're going to be talking about the video game of Omori. So if you haven't played it for yourself or watched someone else play it, how do I say this? The game is kind of an experience, and I would hate to rob someone of that experience, and I would hate to be the bringer of spoilers. So please keep in mind that there's a lot of spoilers that we're going to be talking about if you haven't played the game for yourself. I also want to say that what I talk about as far as mental health stuff with trauma and anxiety and stuff like that is not representative of all things mental health. As in, just because I say something, if that doesn't apply to you, that's because we're all different individual people. It's kind of a your mileage may vary kind of a thing. Just like what I'm saying doesn't represent all of the opinions of every single mental health professional out there. I also want to throw out there that just because I'm talking about possibilities of emotions or mental health connections when it comes to video game characters, I can't actually diagnose video game characters. Diagnosing is something that I need feedback from the other person, and diagnosing is something that becomes more accurate the longer you work with someone. There's a lot of different factors in that, and I can't diagnose a video game character. I can't diagnose anybody in Omori. So even though I can give some general thoughts on overall things that I noticed, this isn't diagnosing anybody in this video game. Also, I may miss a lot. I've only played through the game once. I've gotten one ending. The game has more that I know of. I don't know how many. So I'm also coming from this perspective that I have not seen everything that this game has to offer at this point. I'll probably play through the game at least one more time to get a different ending, to see the different things that the game has to offer. But I feel like that's important to throw out there, that I know I've missed a lot in this game, and that can impact some of the things that I'm talking about. Having said all of that, considering the work that I do, like in my professional work, you know, doing therapy things, I think I forget sometimes that not everybody knows therapy-related terms. And so I want to kind of, I guess, give some information before I talk about how this information relates to Omori. So in some of my videos, I've talked a lot about trauma. For me, it feels like it's hard to not see that connection, but I want to give some context behind what that means. So overall, I think that in society and in culture, we look at trauma as though it is these events itself that happen to us. I think probably the most common thing that we think of with trauma is like veterans and what veterans experience through whatever it is that they do. But trauma isn't actually the events that we experience. And I think that's a very important thing to remember when we're talking about trauma. Trauma is not the event itself. Trauma is how we process very scary, overwhelming, terrible, horrifying things that happen to us. And a caveat to that is that our personal perception plays a role in that. So, hypothetically, we can have two different people experience the same thing, and one might perceive that event as traumatic because of a variety of different factors, and the other person may not. So perception does play a bit of a factor in that. And I will totally own that I am not an expert when it comes to parts of the brain. That's where my brain starts to get some information overload. But I do know that when it comes to trauma, the parts of our brain that get impacted by trauma, because we can see this on brain scans and all kinds of different stuff, the science is out there. But the parts of the brain that get impacted by trauma are the parts of the brain that deal with memory and emotions. And so some of the biggest things that happen when we have experienced a traumatic event and we're trying to process through trauma is we have a hard time coping with our emotions. We might experience flashbacks because flashbacks are connected to memory. We might have some nightmares. We often avoid things that have some kind of a connection to the past, and like as in we're avoiding these big scary emotions. And I think that talking about what trauma is important, because trauma to me feels like such a big thing in the game. And if I'm using this word, I think it's important that we both are on the same page about like what this word means, basically. I also noticed that I talked about anxiety a lot when I was playing through the game. And again, I think it's important to be on the same page about where I'm coming from when I'm talking about the concept of this word of anxiety. And anxiety is something that can be caused by trauma. Like it can be an after effect of trauma, or it can just, you know, be its own thing. Anxiety is I'm trying to think of how do I explain these things in like the simplest way possible. But anxiety is a response to stress. Anxiety is when our fight, flight, or freeze system kicks in. You can also think of it as our crisis response. So a crisis happens and our brain only cares about us surviving. Or survival brain is another analogy that I've used. I feel like in my line of work, I use a lot of analogies. Sometimes an important thing to note with anxiety is that it's not always real danger. It's sometimes perceived danger. We feel like we're in danger, and that feeling is very real, which is why we feel anxious. But it's not always a real danger. And sometimes that's an important distinction. I've also taken a shit ton of notes. I have like 3 pages of notes when it comes to general thoughts that I've had about the game since I've finished it. And it's like, oh yeah, that's a mental health thing that I want to talk about. So I'm referring to notes randomly throughout this video. There's a lot here. Another thing that I think is important to talk about when we're talking about this game is the concept of disassociation. And disassociation is essentially a defense mechanism. What a defense mechanism is it's how... Oh my God. Starting that over. Disassociation is a defense mechanism. It is how our brain tries to protect us from something incredibly scary. It can be because of trauma. It can be because of other things. This is not the only defense mechanism out there too. There are a variety of defense mechanisms. This is not something that we usually do consciously. We don't always know that we're doing it. So for example, defensiveness is a defense mechanism. It's a super common defense mechanism. We don't always know that we're being defensive. I think of disassociation as something where our brain gets so much information, potentially from trauma, potentially from other things, and we can't handle it, we can't process it. So our brain has all of this information, overload, and so our brain has to create a break somewhere. Our brain has to say like, stop, I can't do this anymore. And so there's some kind of a point where there's a break, and there's some kind of a point where we disconnect. And sometimes that disconnection is like we disconnect from emotions, we disconnect from thoughts, we disconnect from whatever. And that disconnect, that distance that we create, like that's the disassociation. And some amount of disassociation is normal in the sense that when we drive from point A to point B, we drive a lot. As adults, for a great deal of us, we drive a lot throughout our life. So we go on autopilot. That's some amount of disassociation. Probably not great when you think about how dangerous that could be, but like, is that some disassociation? Probably. Scrolling endlessly on social media. Is that some amount of disassociation? Could be. Again, like your mileage may vary with all of these things. And we don't consciously know that we're doing these things, but this is how our brain tries to cope, tries to create some distance, tries to protect ourselves. Going back to this idea of Omori and how these things showed up in Omori. Something that I feel like I noticed fairly-ish early on is that the game tried to create anxiety in the player with certain things. So the game really trained me, at least, to be anxious with stairs. Let's go back. Let's go back. It's like, oh, I've learned that stairs are scary. Stairs are where there's red light. Stairs are where we've had hands slap us. Stairs have become like, at one point in the game, the stairs were very exaggerated. And it's like, oh, like, this is not great. nothing good really happened with stairs, to the point where if there were stairs coming up, me as a player, I felt like I was becoming trained to be like, oh great, here are stairs. Like what horrible thing is going to happen with stairs? I also noticed that there was kind of a similar pattern with the shadow or the something in the mirrors. So as soon as I noticed that the bathroom had the something behind Sunny, that was also a pattern. It's like, oh, let me go check the mirrors. Let me see if it's there. But that was also something where there was that little bump of anxiety right before checking, because so much of anxiety too is this anticipation of an event. Usually the event itself is not as bad, but it's the anticipation, the way we talk to ourselves about it ahead of time. That's another big characteristic with anxiety too. And that's something that I noticed as well. Another pattern that I noticed when it came to this idea of anxiety and like how we kind of see things, because anxiety also goes hand in hand with avoidance, is that in black space has so many not so great images. And there's this repeated pattern of going through these doors where not so great things are happening. So there's this anxiety before opening up a door where it's like, great, what horrible thing is going to be behind this door? To the point where I found myself welcoming these hands that would take me away from that.
Where are those stinking hands?
Oh, thank you, please. So the anxiety of opening up these doors and like what horrible thing is going to be behind the door, but also to the point where I found myself welcoming the avoidance of the hands. And the avoidance itself is this whole other theme in the game as well. And I noticed that Omori has, the game has a pattern of really leaning into the storytelling of showing and not telling. Yeah, I said that right, didn't I? I mean, this is usually what you want to go for with your storytelling. If you tell someone something, it's not as great of storytelling. It's kind of letting them read between the lines and figure it out for themselves. I know that I commented a lot during my actual gameplay about Chekhov's gun, and you know, that's a way to have so much foreshadowing. But even just this idea that at one point the game told us that Sunny was afraid of things, but then later on the game wasn't telling us things, and so it's kind of left to us to figure out, well, what do these fear lines mean? What do the fear lines with the eyes mean? And Basil had his own fear lines, but these are things that we were left to kind of piece together, which I really enjoyed as far as that goes, kind of trying to figure that out. One way that we can work on our anxiety is doing something called exposure, or we basically expose ourselves to the thing that is scary for us, because the more we avoid things, the more power we give that. So if we confront our fears, the more we end up teaching ourselves that these things are not as scary as we feel like they are. They're still scary, but we don't have to give them the same power that they would have otherwise. If you are doing something like this, I recommend working with a therapist. Just want to put that out there. But this was also something that I feel like the game kind of showed in its own way, as in Sunny told us, like, I am afraid of heights, I'm afraid of spiders, I'm afraid of whatever. And yes, this is kind of shown in like this cheesy way where it's like, through the power of friendship, I've overcome this. But that's still this idea of this thing is terrifying to me and I'm doing it anyways. And the way that it showed Hiro doing it wasn't as cheesy, and that was still showing how we can do a scary thing even though it is incredibly scary. Because so often what happens is our anxiety will tell us, you can't go outside your comfort zone at all. You need to stay inside your comfort zone at all times, because if something is scary, you can't do it at all. And so we have Sunny, who hasn't been practicing that up until this point, but then started practicing that in their dreams, and then practicing that in reality, at least for the ending that I got. And the fear lines went away. So it's this idea of like, how do we show anxiety in a very visual media? And video games are very visual. So how do we show a vague concept like anxiety in a visual way? And I think that they did that pretty well. Kind of going along with that whole idea of doing things that are incredibly scary. For the ending that I got, there's this implied idea, or maybe openly stated, that Sunny chose to be incredibly vulnerable and open up with his friend about what happened with Mari, which would be so terrifying, I could imagine, because a lot of times when we are being vulnerable, I always think of being vulnerable as like a crab opening up, like that, exposing that soft stuff on the inside. And with that, there's the chance to be hurt. And if we've been hurt before, our instinct is to not do that because we don't want to be hurt again. But then the hard part with that is that we're then also closing off other things. We're closing off the chance for acceptance and love and all of these other things. And so it's almost like through this process of, exposure and doing the hard things, Sunny made that choice to be vulnerable with his friends, which I really like that idea was also shown that, like, yes, we can do hard things, including being vulnerable. Yes, there is a chance of rejection. Yes, there's the chance of people's feelings being hurt, our feelings being hurt, but the chance for good things is also there too. I also feel like this can happen for the player too. This idea of there's often so much stigma around mental health. And what that means is that we don't talk about it very much. And then when we're struggling, we feel like we're the only ones because we know our own experience. We know that we're struggling, but we don't hear other people talk about it. So we think we're the only ones. And I can see a game like this where this is just being talked about. This is being shown. This is being shared. I can see that being really validating, like in its own way for a player, because it's like, I'm not the only one who's having these struggles. And I also really like that. I also could see how the game itself could be a way to do exposure in its own way for the player. It could be a way for us to say, this concept is scary, but I'm going to do it anyways, depending on like what our own experiences are. It's a hard thing to judge about like how that would actually work, but I could see that potentially happening depending on the person, depending on where we're at with everything. Another big theme that I noticed is this concept of shame, blame, guilt, basically negative self-talk. There were a lot of times when the game would use words like deserve or worth or burden or some form of these kinds of things. And these words are so heavy. And what I mean by that, I feel like I say that a lot, but what I mean by that is the way that we talk to ourselves is important. The words that we use matter. And the words that we use matter with other people, sure, but the words that we use matter even more so when we are talking to ourselves. Here's an analogy. Think of it a bit like the words that we use for our own self-talk being like a record, which is a really old reference, but a record or some kind of music that gets played on repeat in our head. And as someone who's worked in retail for far longer than I'd like to admit, when you listen to music on repeat for again and again and again, there gets to be this point where you tune it out. It's a lot. Like, you just can't. There's only so many times I can listen to holiday music. I just can't do it. So we tune it all out, but that doesn't stop the music from influencing us. We might still walk to kind of like the beat of the music. We might tap our toes. We might like sway to it. And that's kind of how our own internal thoughts go. So we may not notice what our internal voice or thoughts are saying, but they still can influence us. And so when we have internal thoughts that say we're not worthy, or we don't deserve good things, or we're a burden, these are very powerful messages that can have a huge influence on us. I noticed that these things came up a lot in the game, whether it be, I think Basil used some of this language. It can be, this kind of language came up a lot in the battle between Sunny and Omori, which kind of feels like a visual representation of how Sunny probably talks to himself, right? If we say that if Omori is in some way, shape, or form an extension of Sunny, then if Omori is saying those words, it's a bit like Sunny saying it. And that's so hard to, it's a lot to have those internal thoughts. It also kind of makes me wonder if that kind of feels like how we're justifying the way that we leave white space, or some of the things that happen within this dream world, or what Omori does, I guess I should say. I do feel like adding that there is a difference between perception and reality, and knowing that something is our perception is important. You know, we can have these internal battles and we can feel like these things are true, and that feeling is very valid, but that doesn't always make it true. If I were to put this into words saying, you know, I don't feel like I am worthy, that feeling of feeling like shit, like that feeling is worthy. And I feel like saying that because so often our feelings, our emotions, our perspectives get dismissed. We don't feel heard, we don't feel validated. So that perspective, that feeling, where we are coming from is valid, but our thoughts are not facts. We often do not question our thoughts. We often just kind of assume that whatever pops into our head is true. And so when we have these negative thoughts, we don't sit there and look at them and go, oh, like, is this really what's going on? And there is the difference between validating that, like, this idea of, yeah, like, it sucks that you're feeling that way, or however we kind of want to talk about validation. Like, there's a difference between that and saying, like, that is true. So much of the time when we are struggling with trauma, we find ways to cope through the trauma. We find ways to survive, if you will. And we end up learning that those ways of coping are helpful for us, because they definitely helped us at some point in time. Whether it be learning to keep our heads down, or whether it be staying inside all the time for 3-4 years. But just because something has helped us cope in the past doesn't mean it always helps us cope. So something that can happen with trauma is we learn to cope in the moment, and then we get out of that traumatic experience, and our brain kind of gets stuck in that trauma moment. And then we just keep doing the same things that helped us survive, but those same things don't help us outside of the trauma. And so with Sunny, some of these things that we see in the game, like the dreams and staying inside, those things could have helped in the moment, but are they currently helping now? And when we're talking about our own stuff, it's really hard to see all of these things. It's really hard to see how much we shame, blame, and guilt ourselves, because we see it as reality instead of a perspective. Kind of talking a little more about how much perception, I almost said perceptive, that's not what I mean. How much perspective played into the game. I think that is such an interesting concept that the game really played into, because I think when we play a game, we assume that whoever is telling the story, or frankly any media, honestly, we just assume that whoever is telling the story is a reliable narrator until we're told otherwise. Because most stories are told from the perspective of a reliable narrator. And I feel like an unreliable narrator is kind of hard to pull. This is totally my perspective, but I feel like an unreliable narrator is kind of hard to pull off and keep them likable. That's a great transition into this idea of perspective, because I find that really fascinating, like how much the game really played into that. And everything in this game is really told through Sunny's perspective. And Sunny is not a reliable narrator, which means all of this, the entire game, not just the dream world, but everything is we are seeing it through Sunny's eyes. And what that means is that for me, I can see it as though it's easy to question what is actually happening, because our perspective can change so much. It's this idea that, to use an analogy that I've used before, our perspective is a bit like the glasses that we may wear, where changing our perspective is like changing the lenses in our glasses. If I get my prescription changed to my glasses, it quite literally changes how I see the world around me, but also myself when I look in the mirror, ironically. And so everything in this game is told through one character's perspective, and they're struggling with how they see themselves and the things that they've done. So in the dream world, there's literally a filter on everything that changes how they see their friends and their relationships with their friends and their sister and everything. But even in reality, could some of that be changed because of this concept of perspective? Well, when you have an unreliable narrator and everything is through their lens, it's hard to tell. I think that that's interesting for me through, like, just for like a player perspective, but I also feel like it reflects a lot of how reality is. Like, everything that I experience in my own life is the same. It's only through my own perspective. People can communicate with me, and that might change my perspective, but I'm still always going to interpret that language that they use and that communication that I receive through my own filter. And I mean, like, that's how some misunderstandings happen and you know, et cetera, et cetera. And it's kind of this idea that just because we tell ourselves something, we tell ourselves a story, we tell ourselves that we are good or we are bad or whatever, doesn't make it true. It kind of goes back to what I said before, that, you know, the words that we use in our head, our internal self-talk, all of those things, just because that happens for us doesn't make it true. And the same with these kinds of filters that we use or perceptions, these are all analogies, but the same kind of goes for that too, because the words that we use and how we talk about ourselves impact how we perceive the world around us too. All of these concepts are things that are very interconnected. And this is why two people can have the same experience and walk away with different emotions from it and perceive it very differently and describe it differently too. Shifting away from like perspective and self-talk, there is a lot of avoidance in this game. I mentioned before that, like, me as a player, I wanted to avoid a lot of the things in Black Space after being exposed to it a lot. It was kind of like, yes, you, the hand, please take me away from this. That's something that I noticed in me as a player. It kind of felt like that was purposeful too. Like, Black Space had so much purposeful, scary stuff. I get the impression that it's to make scary... It is to make Sunny afraid of what will happen if he continues on this path to find the truth. And so it's like, I'm going to make just a random shit, just a bunch of random shit that you're afraid of. So then you won't want to continue. So there will be so much of a desire for avoidance that you will want to just leave. So like, it feels like Black Space inherently is made to create the biggest avoidance ever, to protect something. Which is what I feel like a lot of avoidance is for, but I kind of want to get back to that in just a second and put a pin in that. But the other ways that I feel like the game kind of showed avoidance is the fact that is the fact that Sunny refused to go into certain rooms or certain places in the house. The treehouse. I didn't even know it was a treehouse until later in the game. The closet. I clicked on that wall so many times, and Sunny was like, there's nothing here. What are you talking about? There's no door here. It's like, there is. There is. This was so validating when it finally showed up. There was some avoidance, I think, with stairs at first. There's basically anything that had a strong connection to the past, anything that had a strong emotional connection to the event itself or to Mari, there was reluctance to do it. There was that avoidance because, like, this thing feels too much for me, so I'm going to avoid it. Which is exactly how avoidance works. It's this desire to avoid the scary thing. And I do want to point out that having the desire inherently, like, is not avoidance. It's like the follow through, I feel like, because the desire often goes hand in hand with anxiety. It's like, I don't want to do this scary thing. Well, that doesn't feel like avoidance to me. That just feels like anxiety. I think at one point in one of my videos, I had said, like, well, why wouldn't we want to leave Mari? Like, why wouldn't we just want to stay here? Why wouldn't we want to make all of this happy? And so much of that feels like how we might talk about avoidance too. This idea of if we honestly had a choice between a dream world potentially or feeling like we're doing something that helps or whatever versus purposely facing a scary thing, it feels so easy to say, I'm just going to stay in this dream world or I'm going to do whatever. it feels hard in the moment to see that avoidance doesn't help in the long run. Avoidance a lot of times feels like it does help in the moment, but it's very short term compared to other ways that we might be able to handle things where we're facing our fears. Kind of like, you know, junk food and fast food. It feels good in the moment. Is it the healthiest for us? No, it's kind of a similar idea. But like how avoidance works in reality is this idea that we so much of the time avoid things that are connected to our own anxiety, our own traumas. If we feel like something is making us anxious, we avoid it. We don't want to deal with that. And sometimes we feel like we can't, you know, again, how all of these things are connected. If we are shame, blaming, and guilting ourselves, we may not feel like we have the ability to handle these things too. And so if we feel like we don't have the ability to handle it, it makes it so much harder to face these things. I think I addressed the thing that I put the pin in. I just realized I may not have, but I hope I did. There is also some disassociation as far as these reoccurring dreams or nightmares. There are some theories out there about how when we have this information overload, when we have these things that we haven't processed, the information still the information wants to get processed. And so it kind of finds ways to get inserted into other parts of our lives, whether that be from dreams or nightmares or like they create false memories. And that feels a lot like how we could be talking about this stuff too, in the sense that we have these dreams that got changed, or even seeing things in the real world. When I think about this game, I don't just think though of trauma and anxiety, think of grief and loss. I think when we think of grief and loss, we often think of death. It's just the way we first start talking about it in life, I feel like. But I do think it's important to specify that loss is not just death. It's basically just losing something important to us, losing something that is meaningful to us. I don't think that we recognize that a lot in society. Sometimes people talk about it like, oh, well, you didn't have a death, so it doesn't count. Well, yeah, it still does. Like moving away from someone, that's still a loss. We've still lost something important to us. Losing a job, like so many of these things that do happen to us, they're still impactful. It's still grief and loss. We're still processing through losing something that was important to us. There's this theme in the game about kind of looking for answers. And I feel like so much of the time when we're talking about grief and loss, there's this theme of looking for closure. Like we want to know why, we want to look for answers. Even though a lot of times when we get the answers, we still kind of feel empty. Like it's not what we were actually looking for. Almost like we were hoping that the closure would make the feelings better or go away. I don't know how we would talk about that, I guess. But there is so much of this theme in the dream world of looking for Basil, which feels like we're looking for closure. And Sunny, I don't know how we would say this. Was Sunny talking about it? But there were these conversations about saying that Mari was put in this dream world to be the safe place. She was always at the picnic. She was always at the saving place. And it's this idea of, I want to keep her safe. I want to keep her alive in some way, which I think is something that a lot of us want when we've had some kind of grief, some kind of loss in our life. And there were also those moments when Mari said goodbye. And Mari talked like how I think we imagine a lot of people would talk if we were able to say goodbye. This idea of like, you can do this, and those kinds of things. This idea of basically talking about how can we talk about a future where you can't talk to me anymore, but I want to give you this kind of inspiring message regardless. Which I think is incredibly endearing, but also incredibly sad. Something else that I've noticed is that the game really validates this idea that grief can look different for everybody. I think it's really common to hear that. At least I should specify that by saying, at least in my field, like I hear a lot of conversations about that grief. Like grief can there are these stages of grief and loss. Denial, anger, depression, bargaining, acceptance. I probably got those out of order, but whatever. And there's no like right or wrong way to grieve. There's no right or wrong like order to grieve in. And these are conversations that are very common, I feel like, when we talk about the idea of grief and loss. But I think that when we are actually in that moment, it's a little different, because we might have other people who are kind of like, oh, well, again, it's not death. So like, why are you doing this? Or why are you caring? Or why are you upset? Which feels like saying you're grieving the wrong way. And I like how the game basically took that idea and said, there are a shit ton of ways to grieve. Because we have Hero, who on the emotion chart was listed as sad, but I feel like there is also a lot of people-pleasing stuff. So like, we heard that Hero was extremely upset. Hero lost Mari. Hero lost someone who was incredibly important to him. And Hero was sad. Could we say depressed? I don't know. But Hero was sad for a while. And then it's like it's like Kel was like, yo dog, you're sad. And Hero was like, oh yeah. And Hero is in this family where like his job is to like take care of other people, and his job is like there's so much of the people pleasing stuff that came out about Hero. And so it's almost like he was saying, I'm not doing my job. I'm not taking care of other people. So I wonder if he put on that facade of being happy to please others because he wasn't grieving in the right way or the wrong way, or he wasn't fulfilling his role in the family, or all of these variety of reasons. We have Aubrey, who pushes other people away. And on the emotion chart, she was listed as angry. And I referenced the emotion chart because the emotion chart kind of shows maybe how everybody is grieving after Mari's death. But she even talks about like, I pushed other people away. I misunderstood how everybody was doing. I made assumptions. And Aubrey then coped by having these, like showing all of her emotions on the outside. And bullying other people and like just taking everything out on other people. And that's still grief. And we have Basil, who not only is dealing with grief from Mari, but also this grief of losing Sunny, because Sunny is now not, friends with everybody basically for like 3 or 4 years. So like there's that additional grief of losing Sunny. And then it seems like the friend group kind of drifted apart. So like also losing all the other friends. So grief also kind of feels like it hits harder when it's not just one thing that we've lost. And so Basil has all of that grief, but the one thing that I noticed about Basil is all this anxiety. There was the stomach issues that I think was mentioned at one point, and the fear lines that Basil had even in the dream world. So even Sunny's perception of Basil was that Basil was feeling really anxious, and Basil just seemed to want to help everybody. Could we say that this people pleasing? We could. And then Kel also seemed like this hard thing happened with Mari, but then he also saw how his brother was handling it. And I feel like Kel was maybe in some denial in the sense of like what all was going on. And maybe it's like his role was being the happy one. His role was being the clown, the class clown, because if I can make people laugh, then they must not be sad and everything must be okay. But all of these are ways that we can be processing grief or handling grief, and they're all valid. And if we tell ourselves or tell other people that some ways are right and some ways are wrong, then it's really hard to tell what's happening with ourselves. And it's really hard to, I guess to put it a different way, it's hard to hear our own internal voice. Some other things I noticed, this might sound like a list by now of like, I noticed this, and this. Yeah, it might feel like that way. But I noticed that there was the game slowly revealed information, which like overall plot wise feels appropriate. But I also feel like we could say that that's how it works for ourselves too. We don't just wake up one day knowing everything about ourselves and our own mental health. And trauma's weird. Trauma feels like there's so many super random connections that we don't always know about. it can be so incredibly random as a toaster. I've actually used this example with people before, which is the toaster kind of thing in Omori, I guess, kind of makes it ironic, but we can have anxiety about a toaster and then we can be really confused about why that is. But if our brain feels like there's some kind of a connection to our trauma there, that's just how the trauma works. And sometimes it feels like there's kind of this weird journey to figure out like what's going on, or like how do all these connections work. And it's not always the happiest journey. It might feel like black space, but that doesn't mean that we can't do it. And as I'm saying this, I'm also realizing that maybe I'm overthinking it. Maybe I'm drawing too many connections between like mental health and the game. And that could totally be true. But I still think these are interesting things to think about. Even if they're not like actual representations of mental health in the game, they're still interesting things to think about, if anything. Some other thoughts that I've talked about this in a video before, is this idea of like the content warnings. Because this game is so incredibly heavy, just like the overall themes and everything with the truth and all of that stuff. And in no way am I shitting on the game and how they did content warnings, because there are content warnings at the beginning of this game. I've just noticed that the content warnings in this game are often used in other games too that don't have very similar themes. Like if I were to compare them, which is a hard thing to compare, other games use similar content warnings and their content is not as heavy as Omori. And this is something that I just kind of reflect on and think about. Again, not shitting on this game, but I come from this perspective that the words that we use are important, which is why I talk about like why words like worth and deserve are so important, because our diction, our wording is important. It does matter. And so I think that it can be hard when we're trying to be mindful of our own mental health, if we know that about ourselves, I guess, to really make a decision about if a game like Omori is appropriate for us when there's kind of across the board warnings that are the same for a variety of games, even though the content may not be the same. And I don't know of a good way to handle this. This is just kind of an observation that I've made about maybe like the horror genre kind of a thing. I think one of my favorite parts is the ending that I got, where there was this overall message of hope though. So if you were to ask me if I overall like the game, yes, I do. The video game player in me found it like a mystery. And it was like, I really wanted to find out what happened to these characters and what was going on. And that was fun. Plus the colors and the arts, like all of it was fun. So yeah, I enjoyed playing it. Last time I looked at Steam, I'd put 50 hours into the game and I've only done like one ending. So the video game player in me really liked the game. And the therapist in me really liked how they've portrayed very complicated and vague mental health concepts in a visual way, because I can see that it would be very like how do you portray trauma or anxiety or grief in a medium or in video games, where the way that you portray things is usually visually or with music. So overall, I like it. I don't feel like I have any other thoughts. I've been thinking about this a lot over the past who knows how long. I took in all these notes, trying to figure out how do you talk about the game like this? So I will be finishing at least one more playthrough to try to get a different ending. But I need to take a break. The game is just incredibly long to play through. So I'm going to take a break first, play something else, and then come back to it. I would love to hear your thoughts on these conversations about mental health, and then I will see you guys in the next video.